Those of you who follow me on Twitter may have seen my slow descent into madness at the end of last week over the state of Fallout 76. My recent experience of the game caused me to take down my beta impressions videos because I now feel they do not represent my present experience of the game. In a single word, I would now describe the game as frustrating. What I found is that some of the game's most glaring faults really become apparent with extended play, and it feels as though everything I enjoyed at the start has now become more of a task, with me playing more out of compulsion and lack of anything better than of actually enjoying the game. I could sit here and list the litany of bugs that other people have already talked about. I've had enemies appear out of nowhere, been killed by invisible enemies, had whole areas not load at all, enemies with the wrong model, crashes, freezes and all that sort of thing. Those would all theoretically be fixable if Bethesda worked on it. What I want to argue in this video is actually fixing this game is going to be incredibly difficult. In fact, short of completely recalling the game and making it from scratch, I'm not sure if it can be salvaged. What I'm going to argue in this video is that every single system in this game works against every single other system to create the perfect storm of a bad game. Not only is it riddled with bugs and performance issues, but its foundations are rotten, and Bethesda can do up all the fixings it wants, but it will still inevitably get subsidence. In this video, I'm going to explain how I think the game ended up falling down, how the game's own mechanics trip each other up. In the second part, I'll explain how I think it got to this point, whether it could have been avoided. Then I'll wrap up by discussing how this game can be saved and whether it's even worth bother. This is going to be a long one and maybe not as well organised as I would have liked, but I'm writing this in the aftermath of having read Bethesda's arsey response to complaints about that shit bag they sold of a Power Armor edition, so I'm a bit annoyed with them really. Right, let's go. To illustrate the point I'm making, I'm going to take elements of the game that I enjoyed at launch and explain how that enjoyment has been eroded away by the game's own systems. The first example is exploring. In my beta impressions video, I talked about how much I enjoyed wandering around the game's world and seeing what there was to uncover. I thought, and still think, that it's a beautiful environment and it was easy to start to get into the headspace of my character. Now, however, that has been ruined by encumbrance. At the time of writing, the limits of your possessions are the £400 stash, plus whatever you can carry. That means you inevitably become over-encumbered, and now my experience of wandering has been entering a dungeon, picking up a few things, then thinking to myself, oh, I'm over-encumbered, guess I better leave now. And that's at best. At worst, I'm already over-encumbered when I arrive at a dungeon, and so I simply don't go in. Now, the solution to reaching the stash limit would logically be crafting. However, I've come to find the camp system to be unimaginably fiddly, but everything needs to be built on a foundation, and every foundation needs to be touching the ground, even if it's attached to a foundation which limits how much you can build. Combine that with the low camp budget, and you can hardly use any materials at all. To top all that off, the camp system will sometimes register things as being floating when they're not, clipping through objects when they're not, and saying things need support when they do have support, and even on one occasion I just got unspecified placement error. Now, the public workshops do have a higher budget, I think, but ultimately they're pointless because you lose everything you've built when you log off or crash out, and you have to constantly babysit them from attack, which means you fill most of that budget by building turrets. And even if I was able to build as much as I wanted, I'd still be faced with a problem that there's not really very much to build. You start off with a few options, but the overwhelming majority of buildable objects are locked behind plans. And there are two main ways to acquire plans. The first is via exploring and completing quests, which is all well and good until you get so over-encumbered that you can't really do that anymore. The second way is to buy them from the game's robot vendors. And that leads me to the next problem I've been having, the game's economy. I've been finding caps incredibly rare. The most I've ever had at one time is about 1,000. The most reliable way to make caps when you're not questing, which you might not be able to do because you're over-encumbered, is to sell some of the stuff that you've acquired. The thing is, robot vendors don't accept ammo or plans, the two things that I think you're most likely to want to sell, and if I were to sell my scrap to them, they'd have so few caps I probably wouldn't get much for my money anyway, and they underpay you quite a lot as well. Clearly Bethesda intended the economy to be player driven. Indeed, I expected it would be as well, and I remarked in my beta impressions video that I imagined Walter would set up a little gun shop to make his living. How naive I was. As it turns out, it's almost impossible to get anyone to trade with you. First of all, you need to get someone to accept your trade offer at all, it's itself no guarantee. Then you need to navigate clunky trade menus and manually select every individual item you want to offer. If the other player hasn't got fed up in the time it took you to do that, they might not be easily able to tell what you're offering without pressing a separate button prompt. Then, odds are all you're selling is crap you don't want, and if you don't want it, then you can bet no one else does either. Anything you can make, anyone can make. Anything you can find, anyone can find. And anything you can't use, no one else can. Your best bet is ammo, and even then, in my experience, nobody even buys that. Only once ever has anyone bought anything off me, and I was so pleased when that happened that I took a few photos of me stood next to them, and they became my best friends since that guy in the beta listened to me playing piano. I think that trading is another issue where it links to one of the other issues in the game, which is that nobody talks to one another, which makes trading a lot harder. No one talks to one another because I reckon we all have chat on blanket mute, since Bethesda inexplicably didn't include a push-to-talk feature which should come as standard on PC. So, to recap, the core gameplay loop involves gathering junk to gather power and resources and craft. This is hampered by the stash limit, which means that you can't explore to gather that junk. So to get rid of your stuff you need to build, but you can't build because of in-game limits and simply a lack of stuff to build. You can't get more stuff to build without money, and you can't explore to get money if you're over encumbered, then you need to sell your stuff, except you can't, because no one, and not even the game's own vendors, will buy your stuff. Other players certainly won't buy it, and no one will communicate that they want to buy anything because all the mics are muted, at least I know mine is. At the end of the day though, why would you even bother exploring, because there's not much to find when you know that everyone is dead. I lost a lot of interest in the endless terminal entries, just experiencing interesting stories that I don't get to play a part in, and listening to the overlong dialogue. I mean, just listen to this bullshit.
So this one time, Chuck, he was the guy who came up with this crazy idea. He laid out explosive bait along the trail after a raid. Then, when the responders came looking for us with their tracking dogs, well, let's just say the hounds lost their scent. You know, because their heads were blown off. Whatever, you get what I'm saying.
You know, we got it, we understood the joke. I mean, it sounds like something somebody writes in a mod which they think is funny, rather than something that's been written by professional video game writers who should know not to include so much wastage, and certainly not to try and explain literally everything anyone says. So, what the hell happened? How could Fallout 76 have turned out to be such an abominable mess? Let's be honest, we all know what these issues have in common. They all cluster around the online element. I know and understand that the stash has to be limited because it needs to be accessible from any stash point on any server at any time. And trying to keep track of too many items would, so Bethesda claim, cause problems. On the issue of the public workshops, you simply have to be kicked out when you disconnect, because otherwise it wouldn't take very long for every workshop to be claimed. And anyway, it's not as if you'd be able to defend it when you're offline. We all saw it coming that the online element would be bad, and I was very apprehensive about the game when I first heard Howard's announcement. The thing is, I was looking in some of the wrong places for the issues, and I think so was Bethesda, but we'll come on to that in a minute. The other players were the big fear, griefing. As a result, a lot of players' understandable fears that griefers would ruin the game. Bethesda went to every possible length to limit PvP, but in my experience, I've only been shot at once, and whether that's because Bethesda's measures worked, or most players simply would never have griefed anyone anyway, we'll never know. But what I do know is that PvP is so pointless, they may as well take it out of the game. I've digressed a little from my central point here, though it is somewhat related. How did this happen? Why is 76 such a bizarre mesh of clashing mechanics? How the hell did no one at Bethesda spot this? I can only guess, but I do have a theory which stems from some of my own experiences which I find somewhat compelling. I'm a historian by training, and if there's one thing I've learned from my time working at a university, it's that those who practice critical theory are often woefully disconnected from how people really interact with and experience the world. And I think that Bethesda simply did not understand or anticipate how people would really interact with and experience their game. For example, I think there was an expectation that player-on-player interaction would happen much more often and would be much more appreciated, hence the clunky trading menus and the lack of push-to-talk. I can imagine them all sat round in the office playing the game and having a right good laugh with their friends, but you just sort of ask each other for supply trades, and they do. They give each other the stuff to drive any lead, and go, hey, have my lead. They completely understand their own game on a mechanical level, and so they have no trouble building and trading and knowing the best way to do things. The reality of voice chat is that rather than just hearing your friends, you're far more likely to hear someone being called for their tea and then explaining that they can't pause online, someone's kid calling them, a dog barking, sirens going off, doors opening and closing. So we mute our mics. I think there's an assumption that players would be far more willing to create their own factions and stories than they actually were, especially since they got their mics turned off. Even if people did want to engage in faction-based battles, PvP has so many barriers to entry that you just never do it. It's yet another example of mechanics getting in the way of one another, and this must be why the game's story is so bare bones, because we're supposed to make one up ourselves, but we are hampered at every turn by Bethesda's own design decisions. All of this is symptomatic of a game which doesn't know what it wants to be. Clearly they wanted to create a co-op Fallout experience. Indeed, they said as much, and they described the game as having been spun off from a planned co-op mode in Fallout 4. However, they weren't quite willing enough to lean into the online elements for fear of alienating their traditional fanbase, evidenced by their assertions that you can absolutely play this game solo. The thing is, as you get further into the game, it becomes painfully obvious that is an overstretch. The low-level areas are fine, which is why I didn't notice it at first, but it soon becomes apparent that the game is intended to be played with more than one person. Take the AI as an example. In Fallout 4, AI enemies were tethered to certain areas. They had designated areas where enemies would engage you in combat, and they were linked to them via linked references which had keywords giving combat instructions such as whether it was supposed to hold position or not. It seems in Fallout 76 there are no such limits, because enemies will fucking rush you. I had a battle with an entire dungeon's worth of enemies which took place in a single stairwell as they all charged me down. In addition, they will chase you to the ends of the fucking earth. There is no escape once something is aggroed on you. I've been griefed by the AI more than I have been by human players. Clearly, if there was more than just one of me, then the swarm would be a little more spread out. And further to this, I've often found that the enemies level and their damage and health have little in the way of a link. So I can kill a level 60 Feral Ghoul quite easily, whereas with my level 60 something character, whereas a level 24 Assaultron will fuck me up. I shouldn't be such a high level and still not feeling powerful. My guess is they didn't want us to become too powerful so that players massively outmatched each other, but they seemingly didn't want us to fight as well because of all the PvP restrictions. As I said, this game is neither a fully MMO style game, nor is it a fully story driven RPG style game. It's not really anything. Could any of this have been avoided? Yeah, maybe, but it would have required the game to be in beta for a lot longer. I was incredulous when I heard that the beta was only going to last 2 weeks across all systems. I couldn't believe they'd have time to make any major changes, and yeah, I was right. Clearly the beta was intended to stress test their systems, fueled by their paranoia over a server-side disastrous launch, and lost sight of what would happen if the game was simply broken at the client side. Perhaps Bethesda simply thought their game was so great it wouldn't need any fundamental changes. They were wrong. I mean, God only knows how long it would have had to have been in beta to save it though. Perhaps Jim Sterling was right when he said they should have been launched in early access and stayed there. I reckon it would have needed months in beta for some of the flaws I've described above to become apparent, and longer again to fix it. One way Bethesda might have mitigated the damage was through expectation management. The game was poorly marketed at every single turn. From the moment of its announcement it was badly handled. They intentionally built up hype and allowed speculation that it was Fallout 5 to run rife. They made it their major announcement at E3 with a massive marketing campaign to boot. They followed all that up with a pricey collector's edition akin to Fallout 4's and priced it up as a full price release. In reality, this was never meant to be Fallout 5. It was a spin-off of an idea for Fallout 4's multiplayer mode, which was allowed to run rapidly out of control. If they downplayed the game, presented it as, here's a little extra we've been working on, and priced it lower than a full price release, we might have all been sitting around here saying how surprised we were at how much stuff was in this little extra spin-off title. Instead, we're sat here shitting on it. So, can this game be saved? Should this game be saved? I've already answered, I think, the first question at the start, which is probably not really. They can mitigate some of the issues I've stated, and indeed they are doing so, as they've already pledged to upgrade the stash limit. Of course, this will only ever be a temporary fix, because I'll inevitably hit that stash limit again. And it's not impossible, but I have so much junk in my inventory, its weight limit only kept low by perks, but I already have too much to go in there from £400 to £600. As I said, this limit is necessary because of the online element, which just seems to be fatal for the game. I don't think it's impossible for Fallout to have multiplayer components, it just needs to commit more than it did to one side, and so not end up in this weird halfway house. For player-based trading to have been at its most effective, it would need to have some kind of central hub area, which is where they could have placed human NPCs, but made them unkillable, as indeed the robot NPCs are. Of course, perhaps they didn't put those in because they wanted to have the nuclear bombs thing in it, which also seems to be another pointless addition, because nuclear bombs are so hard to fire, it's not like you're going to be launching them willy-nilly, but I'm digressing anyway. The nuclear bomb element would have meant that you could just nuke a town centre and then kill all the NPCs, or not kill all the NPCs, which would be weird. So what they really need to do is strip out the nukes altogether, or just make it so you can only fire them on Fisher sites as part of a narrative purpose, and create some kind of central hub where you can gather quests, set up little trading outposts to trade with other players, and have real characters in it. This game does almost have a story, and every so often it draws me in. The kind of story I enjoy, and what I think makes Fallout New Vegas a masterclass in storytelling, is one which starts off as a small personal story taking place in a larger world, and then at some point that smaller story connects up to the larger world and you're drawn into what's going on. For New Vegas, that moment was when you arrived on the Strip and suddenly you find yourself at the forefront of the NCR Legion conflict you've been hearing all about all the way through the first act. And I did for a moment think 76 was going to pull this off in its own way. The game starts off with you in the vault and your small personal quest is to find the Overseer. It soon becomes apparent something bigger is going on, and your journey to find the Overseer drags you into it. Sam Blackwell and the Free States have been appearing in the background all the way through the game, so when I finally entered Blackwell's bunker for the first time, I thought, this is it, this is where my small story connects to this wider story. Then on the way to the White Spring bunker, I saw a rock with a purple choose texture placeholder texture, and I was killed by an invisible enemy. Then when I got to the bunker, and of course it was just robots everywhere, and I had to do another series of back and forth pointless fetch quests, I realised what a waste of fucking time this all is. They could always go down the route of completely remaking this as a real single player Fallout game, and to be honest, I think that's the only way you could really save this game at this point, because of all the sort of fundamental flaws of the online element that I've talked about. Yeah, I might still play this game as a time waster and have YouTube or Netflix on in the background, but I don't think this game will ever truly be great. And it's disappointing because it could have been great, and if you were to remake the whole thing from the ground up as a single player experience, you've got a really good game there. And I actually came up with an alternate story for it. The game would begin in Vault 76 on the morning of Reclamation Day. You create your character and you go into the Vault 76 atrium where the Overseer and all your fellow dwellers have gathered. She delivers a speech and the doors open, except before the war it was public knowledge the vault would be open after 25 years, and so there are bitter, desperate refugees waiting outside who want shelter. Fighting breaks out, people are killed, you flee, you arrive in Flatwoods where you first encounter the responders, you're injured and need help, which they give you. You know you're not the only survivor of the attack on the vault, and so your story is to try and track down the other survivors. But you're going to need the help of the locals, who aren't exactly friendly to the best and brightest of America who rode out the last 25 years in a vault while they suffered and fought for every day they survived. There are thousands of unique characters and stories which could be told, with characters who experienced the direct aftermath of the war, and given the vault's background, you could either be respectful or snobbish, which could give you the sort of moral choices dilemma without being the classic give £1 million to charity or kill a load of puppies sort of thing. It soon becomes apparent that there's something bad going on in Appalachia, the Scorched. The thing is, the different factions are too busy fighting each other to help out. The responders just don't have the resources. The Free States don't like to be asked for help when they were mocked for their conspiracy theories before the war. The Brotherhood are a bunch of paranoid zealots who don't work well with outsiders. The Enclave are just looking to dominate at any cost, and the Raiders have the manpower, but they are just purely ruthless. As an outsider, you can either serve as a mediator between these groups, or you can destroy the ones who won't cooperate and take whatever you've got to fight the Scorch Beasts. All the building blocks for a character-driven interactive story are in the game, but they're just badly assembled. So that concludes my somewhat ranty video about Fallout 76. I have so many thoughts on this game, but I am certain I've forgotten some, but I really just wanted to get some of these thoughts out there. I can see where this game could have been good, but it constantly gets in its own way, with every system seeming to work against every other system to create an experience which is simply frustrating. It's mechanically frustrating, and it's frustrating because I can remember and still see elements of what I enjoyed about it at the start. It's just that I'm finding it harder and harder to enjoy those elements. Really, it just makes me sad, and Bethesda are really going to have to get their shit together and return to form for Fallout 5, because they have used up every ounce of goodwill that I had for them now.